Thank you for everyone who's joining in today. Welcome to our BVIPsych webinar series. Today, our topic is about specific learning disabilities, and it is a panel discussion. If you need ASL interpretation, click the interpretation button on the Zoom bar to access the ASL channel, the American Sign Language channel. I'm Meaghan. I'm the school psychologist with the California School for the Blind Assessment Center, and I'm a co-coordinator for BVIPsych. BVIPsych is a National Association of School Psychologists interest group. And if you're not a paying member of NASP, we also have a Google group for school psychologists and mental health professionals that is also called BVIPsych. So information to join our Google group will be in the handout for today. All of the resources created by our panelists and other resources mentioned will be linked in one handout. So the link for the handout will be put into the chat. This school year, we are very happy to be offering a series of free webinars about various topics related to working with blind, low vision, and deafblind students. The next webinar in our series will be a presentation on autism that will be on Wednesday, December 17th. The registration link will also be in today's handout. And if you're interested in presenting for our webinar series, you're welcome to submit a proposal via a Google form that will also be linked in our handout. And so now on to our main event. Today, we are so pleased to have an expert panel with us to address your questions that you submitted during registration on specific learning disabilities and visual impairment. Our lovely panelists will introduce themselves, and let's start with Beth.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Beth Jones, and I am employed with East Texas A&M University as a professor of special education. My interests there are assistive technology, visual impairments, and collaboration with parents and families. As a side note, I am a person with a visual impairment who has two kiddos with visual impairments, one of which who is also comorbid LD. So that is why I'm particularly interested in our topic today.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Beth. And we'll go over to Carol. Oh, sorry,
I'm sorry.
To Meaghan Adams. Sorry, my bad. I was looking at the wrong document.
I'm Meaghan Adams. I've been a school psychologist for the past 21 years, specializing in MTSS and GEI, early literacy and dyslexia, and then supporting specialized groups of kiddos. And then the past 5 years, I've also been a special education coordinator for different programs within our district, including gifted RVI programming, adapted PE, professional therapy dogs, among other things. So it's good to be here.
Thank you for joining us again, Meaghan. And now we're going to go on to Carol.
Okay. My name is Carol Evans, Dr. Carol Evans. I got my doctorate in my 60s. I started out as a teacher of students with blindness and low vision, did that for a number of years, and we were unhappy with the psychological evaluations we were getting that ruled out learning disabilities and blaming it all on the visual impairment. So, I've got to let my dog up on my lap or she'll never quiet. She's one of two. This is Lucy. And so I went back to school to become a school psychologist, specializing in our population, and also worked for a number of years in regular schools, but taking on students with VI. My main purpose in being here is to pass on what I know before I forget it all.
Thanks so much, Carol. And we'll go next to Heather.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Haynes Smith. I am an associate professor at Trinity University in San Antonio in the Department of Education, focused on teacher education. I studied at the University of Kansas under a doctoral fellowship funded by OSEP and OSERS on MTSS and low incidence, but also dyslexia and LD. I am dyslexic, so I'm happy to share that identity here. A lot of my work is in schools, so early implementation of science of teaching reading, effective interventions, but I'm also doing a lot of work in universal design for learning in both K-12 and post-secondary. It's a lot about accommodations, and I'm just grateful to be here today to chime in. My expertise is not in school psychology or VI, but I do a lot of work there and have published articles with Beth, so glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Heather. And next we'll go to Meaghan Mogan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meaghan Mogan, and I'm a speech language pathologist. I worked for about over 20 years at the Arizona State School for the Deaf and Blind in Southern Arizona in Tucson, primarily working with students with visual impairments who have additional disabilities, including deaf blindness. I started a full-time doctoral program last year, so I'm in my second year, also OSEP funded. And I am centered on working on the inclusion, actually changing systems to make sure we fully include students with extensive support needs. And my emphasis is on visual impairment and deaf blindness. So thank you all for attending today.
Lovely. And next we'll go over to Lee.
Hi, my name is Leah Reed, and I work as the Dyslexia and Math Specialist at the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I started off getting my master's degree in VI long ago, and did work for a year at the Texas School for the Blind and several summer schools, but I discovered that I just really had a passion for learning how to teach reading. So I became a resource teacher where I worked with all kinds of handicapping conditions and got my certification as a certified academic language therapist and a qualified instructor. And all those years really weren't working a whole lot with the VI field. But then in 2020, the principal at the School for the Blind remembered me, and they needed for the first time a dyslexia specialist and who is also certified in the VI field. And I was thrilled to come back to my roots in the VI world. So since 2020, I've been working in that capacity.
Thank you, Lee. And then last but not least, Alicia, thank you for joining us.
Everyone, my name is Alessia Spies. I am a school psychologist and educational psychologist at Perkins School for the Blind. I work in the secondary program here. I've worked in the admissions and evaluations office for several years, doing evaluations for students who don't go to Perkins, and I'm really excited to be here with this amazing group of people.
Right. Thank you so much. And so now on to our questions. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I'm going to hand it over to my amazing colleague, a speech language pathologist in our California School for the Blind Assessment Center, who will be reviewing all the questions for us today.
Hi, thanks so much, May. My name's Rebecca. If there's any SLPs in the room besides myself and Megan, and you're interested in joining the sister group to this group, the SLP BVI group, there will be a link in the handout that you can access. Our first question today, the left fusiform gyrus and other regions related to visual word form are believed to be repurposed for tactile word form in blind individuals. Do you believe this could mean slow response to Braille learning or indicate dyslexia or a learning disability?
This is Alessia. I can start, and if other people want to chime in, please feel free to do so. From my experience, diagnosing dyslexia or determining SLD can be really complicated and convoluted with our population. From my experience, especially working with the older students, one of the biggest factors that we have to consider is their educational history and their exposure history. At the later levels, we might want to consider what their experience was working with the TBI, their access to school, learning Braille, and their exposure, how often they were learning Braille, how frequently. For the younger students, it's also important to consider that their access is not the same as text learning. For example, students with vision who are text learners are exposed to text throughout their early childhood, whether it's just from looking at, text around them or in their vicinity. Exposure to Braille starts at a much later age, so that's an important factor to consider. So I just wanted to start with that because I think slow response to Braille is just part of learning Braille. The research shows that learning Braille does take longer. I apologize, that's my school bell. Yeah, so the research shows that, learning Braille inherently just takes longer. There's a great article that I've plugged into the notes written by Marnay Lofton. You may or may not have read it, but she just highlights that Braille readers are slowed by the need to use their hands and tactile perception. It's just inherently slower. It relies more on memory and using contextual skills. Then learning contractions at a higher level is often very complicated. The whole process is just more convoluted than reading text. Vocabulary development rate begins to decrease around the second grade. So around the second grade, we often see Braille readers kind of start to fall behind their same age peers. And then also she highlights some really great indicators of early reading problems and then later reading problems. And so from my perspective, I find that these are better indicators of dyslexia or learning disability, rather just a slower pace because of these reasons. So she highlights that lack of understanding of sounds and syllables, struggles when you struggle to decode familiar words using phonics or patterns. Difficulty with rhyming words and showing little interest in trying to read are great or better early indicators of reading problems. And then later reading difficulties are better indicated by slow and labored reading, like you highlighted, but not necessarily slowed learning to Braille. It's I think more of the reading process. Reading errors, lack of meaning. The students read words and passages without concern for their meaning. And then maximum effort for minimal comprehension in reading are some of the indicators that we might see for learning disabilities and dyslexia. And I also wanted to add, and I'm sorry I forgot to mention this, I think a big piece is assessment, looking at different patterns, strengths and weaknesses in the area of reading, language comprehension, listening comprehension. This can really highlight these patterns. So I would, overall responses, slow response to reading Braille. We have to think about the overall profile and also to consider comorbid diagnoses. A big piece could also be fine motor, tactile discrimination challenges. That's a big challenge with some of our students, or other neurodevelopmental disabilities, auditory processing challenges. So we'd want to rule out anything like that before, well, they could have both. We just want to consider the whole picture.
Wonderful. Our next question is, should we use a response to intervention/instruction with Braille learning as a solid indicator of dyslexia/SLD based on what we know about repurposing of the word form area and the high rates of neurodevelopmental comorbidity in blind individuals?
So I can jump in here again. I think this question kind of plays off the first question. So Carol Ann, if you want to jump in, like I said, I just think it's very important to consider, the bigger picture of their history. I think modern public school RTI framework, thinking about it being like 8 to 12 weeks, that's a very limited amount of time to consider their exposure level. So taking from what I said before, considering their history, their exposure, whether they've worked with a TBI, how often they worked with a TBI prior to the traditional RTI method, is what I would recommend, along with a comprehensive evaluation to look at all those different areas.
Thank you, Alicia. I want to point out that early language development is one of the most important predictors of reading comprehension ability. Sighted children, it's easy to share joint attention with them. My first baby. I was carrying her around and she was looking at things and then looking at me and looking at a thing and looking at me. So I told her the name of the thing she looked at. And the next day she could look at the thing when I said its name. And with blind children, you have to be deliberate about that. You have to bring the world to their physical body and identify things the same way, like with Helen Keller, everybody's seen that movie. We have to make sure that they're developing language.
I want to chime in there, Carol Ann, if it's okay. Just given my background in MTSS and in that doctoral fellowship, and one of the things, and I'll talk about it probably more later, is how often those prevention models are, misunderstood and misapplied in schools. And I think that, looking back at instruction, so this question specifically is about Braille instruction. I feel like it's just more data, and so much on LD and VI identification is saying more data. It would be interesting to me in a model that was just collecting, screening, and progress in a evidence-based Braille instructional model to just be part of that process. So I just want to chime in there and add that.
Thank you.
All right. I think that's it for question 2, unless anyone else had something to add. Then we'll move on. What are your recommendations for SLD evaluations for students with CVI? I would want to know how to work with kids who have neurological eye diseases that impact the brain function significantly. Looks like it's you again, Carol.
This was the reason that I got into school psychology in the first place, because school psychologists were refusing to identify learning disabilities. And so that was my focus. And I will say that my feeling is that the best way, you have to do a cognitive evaluation and an academic evaluation at the minimum. And the most reliable part of a cognitive evaluation for a student who is blind would be the verbal subtests on the WISC. And that's the test with which I'm most familiar. So and the WISC easily separates out verbal from visual. The Stanford Binet 4, not so much. There's a great deal of visual on the verbal and a great deal of verbal on the visual. And that's just a confound that we can't ignore. And so I believe in students who have enough vision that they are using vision for a great deal of their learning, we should give the visual portions, but interpret them qualitatively. And there are many examples of that in my chapters in Dr. Sattler's book, Assessment of Children, of second volume. And then when doing academic testing, I think we need to be careful about the time limits and interpret their ability to do things within a time limit, also on the cognitive, and outside the time limit, as a way of saying, well, she may require more time to complete complex visual tasks. And if you're still in a state that requires discrepancy, you have to understand that do not report a full-scale IQ. In my last few years of practicing as a school psychologist, I stopped reporting full-scale IQs because there were so many children with broad discrepancies that people would misinterpret that full-scale IQ and decide that the child was intellectually disabled, and that wasn't appropriate. So I think you have to be very careful, and you must add auditory comprehension into the battery, if you're giving, for example, the KTEA or any of the other academic tests, they're not part of a basic battery, you have to add it in, because this can tell us whether there's a language problem and trigger the need. I think every reading evaluation should have a language evaluation also. But since resources are scarce for SLPs in districts, having a poor score or other qualitative indicators that they're not understanding what they're hearing on auditory comprehension, we then have to add a speech language evaluation. As far as I'm concerned, speech and language is king. And that's really all I have to say about that. Anyone else?
Thank you, Carol. I think we'll move on to question 4 if you're done with that one. So our next question is a bit of a long one. I would love to know more about the intersection of SLD and phase 3 CVI. When is it visual perception issues related to SLD? When is it CVI? And are the interventions the same regardless? Our team would like more information on the topic of CVI versus visual perception, learning challenges, and executive function. Do you ever qualify a student for SLD and check off visual processing as one of the processing areas for eligibility? For example, a student with known CVI who you are evaluating for SLD. On the other hand, how do you differentiate SLD with visual perception challenges from CVI? Example, a student with known SLD who is referred for a VI evaluation due to visual processing challenges. And that very long question is in the chat if you didn't catch it all.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, it's a doozy, this one. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I might not fully address all parts of the question. Each of these questions could probably be an hour-long webinar in themselves, so I'll try to touch on multiple parts of it. So I know that we have some very experienced practitioners with us, and we also had graduate students who signed up. So I'll go back to explain what CVI is for those who don't know. So CVI is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by deficits of visual function and functional vision that's caused by neurological damage to the visual pathways and processing areas of the brain. So there's an impact on the brain's ability to accurately process and interpret what the eyes see. And so some examples of CVI characteristics include having challenges with fluctuating vision, increased time needed to respond to visuals, impact of clutter, and there's many different characteristics. So phase 3, this is going along with, go back a little bit. There's various schools of thoughts when it comes to CVI. There has been an effort to come to a standard working definition, and the link to that is in the handout. There was a special commentary on trying to have a standard working definition of CVI because there are different schools of thoughts out there. And so when we're talking about phase 3, that's going with Dr. Christine Roman-Lansky's view of cortical visual impairment. And this is where a person has made significant progress and their visual functioning is the closest to typical levels, though they still have functional vision loss. So they still require adaptations and specialized instructions for their visual skills, such as like maybe needing support to discriminate details and handling complex visual stimuli. So for those who are unfamiliar with CVI, there's also going to be in the handout links to resources with descriptions of phase 3. So distinguishing CVI from specific learning disability is a very complex diagnostic challenge since they often can co-occur and share overlapping behaviors. So for example, a student with CVI who has challenges with their visual fields or visual attention can have reading challenges. Their challenges with reading text can result from problems with seeing, like difficulty due to visual crowding. And the difficulties stem from visual effort that's required to process crowded text, tracking words, and handling visual complexity. So their comprehension might be affected by visual fatigue. For specific learning disability, we're thinking about dyslexia here. This is a language-based learning disability. So going back to what Carol was saying, it's really important to partner with our speech language pathologist friends and really look at language if this is a concern as well, because then reading problems might be stemming from phonological processing or orthographic processing, so looking at letter sound correspondences or language deficits. So if we're thinking about Scarboro's reading rope model, and a link to that will also be added to the handout, we're thinking about what skilled readers need in order to have skilled reading. So that is having language comprehension, which includes background knowledge, having understanding of language structures like syntax and semantics, vocabulary, verbal reasoning, and print knowledge, literacy knowledge. And they also need to have word recognition skills, so being able to decode, have sight word reading skills, things like that. And so we're looking at, are there challenges in those areas? When we're looking at math SLD, so seeing if there's dyscalculia challenges, or maybe looking at, are there challenges with memory or fluid reasoning? I often refer to a chart from Ventura County. Their PSW, or Patterns of Strengths and Weaknesses manual, is awesome. And I like to refer to their compares chart. They had a very nice effort to look at which processing areas might contribute to different academic challenges. So I often refer to the chart that's on page 137 of that manual to think about the relevant processing areas when I'm looking at different academic challenges. So when we're looking at CVI and SLD, we need to make sure that we're partnering closely with our teachers of students with visual impairment. Our teachers of students with visual impairment need to be doing a functional vision assessment and their learning media assessment. And so this might include using CVI screeners like the Teach CVI screener or CVI screeners from Visio. And of course, doing a very robust RIO before getting to the testing. So records review, interview, observations, doing a structured parent or caregiver interview, and assessing in all the relevant areas of processing related to the academic area of concern. And when we're looking at determining if there is an additional or co-occurring specific learning disability, we're looking at whether the learning challenges persist despite appropriate accommodations for the child's visual impairment. So if the student has been provided accessible materials, access to assistive technology, text kerning, so additional space between words or letters, and reduce visual clutter, are they still having challenges with learning? And just a reminder that once you have access to IEP, any area of identified need should be addressed regardless of what area of eligibility is identified. And so there are lots of different interventions related to CVI and specific interventions related to learning disability. I put those links in the handout, and I know that Alicia also wants a comment, and then we'll have to move on because then I know we're over my time limit.
I think this applies to the next question too, but I just wanted to share that the anecdotal information that you can obtain when you're doing direct testing, even if you're breaking standardization procedures, can be incredibly helpful in when you're testing. So if my student has some functional vision, whether it's CVI or a low vision, asking them what they can see on the page often helps. That can be for like a fluid reasoning subtest for cognitive as well. But I just wanted to share because I think Carol Ann said, we don't score an FSIQ, but that anecdotal, qualitative information often helps paint a bigger picture than just using scores.
Wonderful. Okay, our next question is question 5. What direct assessment tools are available for VI and or how to utilize the students' tools to make quote unquote standard tests accessible? Are the preferred assessments for psychological and academic evaluations to use for BVI students or recommended accommodations? The last time I evaluated a student identified as BVI, I used the Braille version of the WJ. What updates have test authors or publishers made to improving accessibility and reliability? Do you have videos that you can share of testing a low vision student and testing a blind student? I'd love to have the nuts and bolts of the best assessments and to help make decisions on evaluating with validity to make me better equipped at decision making for our students. Take it away, May.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Again, this is a big question, and there's a lot to think about, and I want to provide some basic reminders for those of you who are joining us who might have be newer to the field of working with students with visual impairment. So we need to be adapting our measures to the students' visual functioning. So this requires that we are collaborating, again, closely with our teacher of students with visual impairment. Again, we need to be looking at where we can gather meaningful data. And a lot of times that is through a very thorough records review, interview, and observations, lots of observations before we get to our testing. So when we're thinking about direct testing, it's really important to review the guidelines so you know how to appropriately assess our blind and low vision or deafblind students. So I will put in the handout the comprehensive evaluations of individuals with visual impairment, which Carol contributed to, Dr. Jennifer Engel in Canada. She was one of the lead authors, and Marnie Lofton. A lot of thought and consideration went into this document, and the particular guidance areas that I think you should look at include topic 4, looking at test selection and administration, topic 5, looking at considerations for Braille and tactile graphics, topic 6, use of visual stimuli in assessment, and topic 7, adaptation and modification guidance. Again, this question, we could have like a multiple hour webinar to address all the details. So please review this guidance document closely before you start doing your evaluation. I'll also put in the handout a Google document that has a lot of different information about psychoeducational evaluations, but also there's a subtest table by CHC area that can give you ideas for tests that are administered primarily in auditory format, and also tests that are available in large print and Braille. Again, you want to be testing in the media that is appropriate for that student. And how do you know what media that is? You work closely with your teacher of students with visual impairment to get that understanding before you start. And so just to give you an idea of what a battery might look like. And thank you. I see comments in the chat that the handout isn't working for them. So hopefully this one will work. It is set so that everyone can see, but you're not allowed. Oh, thank you, Rebecca, for putting that explanation in the chat. So appreciate you. So an example battery that I have given for a student, it included the WJ for large print to look at cognitive skills, academic achievement, oral language, and we included the opus. We really like the opus on our assessment team. Often Rebecca will administer it when we're working together, and because it looks at listening comprehension, but includes academic language. Also gave a TOVA to look at attention. My TBIs administered the John's Basic Reading Inventory. They use that to help them look at learning media, but it also gives us information. Because remember, when we're doing assessments, a lot of times as a school psychologist, we think, okay, what norm reference standardized test can I do? But that's just one part of our evaluation. There's so much good data and qualitative, good clinical information that we can get from curriculum-based measures or informal measures. And so for this particular student, we saw that their learning challenges were actually from insufficient services. They needed more service to access learning Braille, and all the areas of processing were in the average range. So we're saying, okay, for this student, no, they are not SLD, but they still need SAI service, specialized academic intervention, due to where they were academically. They had fallen so behind, even though all their processing areas were fine. They only had Braille like once or twice a week, and that's not sufficient. So another example where we gave a very similar battery, but also included the NEPC and the CASTLE-2, which Rebecca administered, we saw that there was a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that was consistent with having a specific learning disability. So we saw orthographic processing challenges, listening comprehension challenges, challenges with oral expression, and lots of different memory challenges with short-term auditory and working memory span and long-term retrieval. And so we did, for this other student, identify that they are a student with a specific learning disability in addition to their visual impairment. And I'm looking at the time, and I see that I'm already out of time because so unfortunately I won't show any videos. The videos were not of standardized assessments because due to copyright we can't show, but we do have a lot of different videos on our CSB YouTube channel of our students reading using different tools, like using refreshable Braille displays or with Braille. So there's lots of examples out there. And sorry, I'm long-winded, Rebecca. I'll hand it over to you.
No problem. Okay, so our next question, question 6. What assessments, cognitive and academic, should you give a student who has sudden vision loss and cannot read Braille or print? How should psychs and classroom teachers, academics, test a student for an initial or a triennial evaluation when the student is not proficient in Braille and cannot read print? In other words, is there a test that is solely verbal and is also a valid way to test all academic areas? And for this question, it looks like we have Beth and May again.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right, so I would be cautious of providing a blanket statement of just doing verbal standardized testing. Again, while you can enlist verbal parts of tests, and we'll put in the handout additional guidance documents that you can refer to. You want to remember that, again, standardized tests are just part of the evaluation. Please remember to look at the different data that you can gather through interviews and observations. When you go to look at cases where there are like legal cases, oftentimes the judges, they're really looking at observations. You know, that is a legal component of specific learning disability evaluations. Please spend the time to closely observe the student and see how they are interacting with you know, media and academic tasks within the classroom. And if we're looking at a student who had sudden vision loss and considering whether they have a specific learning disability, think about what was their learning and progress like prior to their sudden vision loss. Were there challenges with the academics related to learning before or with learning the new media, or were other things getting in the way, like phonological processing? We want to observe how the student is engaging in their work and collecting work samples. And I highly recommend engaging in dynamic testing and portfolio assessment. So dynamic testing uses a test, teach, retest model to evaluate learning potential rather than just looking at a snapshot in time, current performance type of results. And so in this kind of dynamic assessment, the examiner provides some instruction or support during the assessment process and then retest to observe any changes in performances. And this is something that my assessment center team does often. And while you probably see connections between dynamic assessment and RTI, dynamic assessment is time limited, done within testing sessions, while RTI is done over a series of intervention weeks. And although there's, I'm gonna also add to the handout, resources related to dynamic assessment, and although they're not VI specific, they can be helpful to consider. And to address the question about the WJ5, I was devastated. I cannot tell you how devastated I was. I've been talking to APH and Riverside, the American Printing House for the Blind. So originally they were planning to do a Braille adaptation for the WJ5. However, I heard recently from Riverside that APH has declined to make a Braille adaptation. And so I'm heartbroken, honestly. I'm hoping they will reconsider. I will put in the handout form. My colleague had this great suggestion. The American Printing House for the Blind has a suggest a product form. I'm hoping if many of us fill out this form and reach out and say, hey, please reconsider and please do make a Braille adaptation for the WJ5, just like you did for the WJ4, that would be wonderful. So I'll put those links in the handout. And I have Beth, who I also know has great comments, so I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you, May. Basically, I want to reiterate everything you said, but I want to call your attention to a document that you'll have in your handout that goes over different subtests from 4 test batteries that I personally used in an evaluation with my own daughter with the subtest, and it kind of goes in, it lays them out by which one is visual, which one is auditory, and then if they're, if they are both modalities. And so that gives a guide as to the 4 measures we used with her, which were WISP-5, the CTOP and the GORT, and the Wyatt 4 is what we used with her. And I think someone in the chat reminded us that all kids with VI are different, just like any, all people. There's going to be, a variety of needs and a spectrum of things you're going to be looking for. And the key there is, as we've said before, working with your teacher of the students with visual impairments prior to testing, during that riot phase, getting prepared if we're going to the testing phase ahead of time with what's going to be needed, thinking about what's going to, be the tests that are appropriate to get the information that you need. We're not just given a test to give it. We're going to use things that are actually going to inform our, moving forward, and that we're being purposeful about the subtests we're picking. And hey, there's some tests, depending on, the kid's functioning vision, that may not need any, accommodation at all. I know there were some, like with my daughter, like when they were doing, just repeat words and sounds back, that didn't take any accommodation at all. Where some skills did take some accommodation, and she used her assistive technology to do those, to perform those skills, such as when they put the block patterns under her technology so that she could see it. But, it's all going to be 100% tailored toward the kiddo. And, it may be in the realm of possibility that we don't need to pursue a further eligibility because, as I believe it was mentioned earlier, they can get the services they need under the BI, and then we're going to, again, not focus the IEP on the eligibility. We're going to focus that IEP and the goals based on their strengths and weaknesses and what they need. And, that informal data is going to play that crucial role. I'm not saying that to say that I think the dual diagnosis isn't necessary if it's, if that can actually be, come to terms with in a way that everybody feels is a reliable and valid way of doing that. Because it does help describe what the student is, dealing with on a daily basis. And I think that's valuable, but I don't think, in a kiddo that may not have developed Braille yet and isn't a print reader, it may be okay that we're not, worried about adding that dual diagnosis yet, that we can serve them through the VI. And I think we need to have the freedom to give ourselves space to just make sure the kid gets what they need. And, that reflects, how we see, what we've seen out of data, and that we're making a plan to move forward from that. So I hope that answers your question. I will turn it back over.
I think you can stay on because
Oh, okay.
I think so. Okay, so let's see here. Question 7. Yes, I am interested in guidelines that can help differentiate between whether a student has learning disabilities or a lack of concepts due to being a blind or visually impaired learner. How can you determine whether there is a comorbidity? I would like more clues on what to look for to establish or determine if a student has, let's say, dyslexia, as opposed to focusing on their visual impairment.
Do you want to start, Beth?
I sure can. Okay, so it can be tricky. Someone mentioned earlier that students who exhibit SLD and students with visual impairments often share characteristics that could mask the other one. And oftentimes the VI is often more noticeable, identified earlier. And so a lot of times that's how it happens, is a kid gets labeled VI, and through a misinterpretation of the legal definition, what we'll talk about with the exclusionary factor, people tended to think you can't be both. Well, some things that they have in common oftentimes are that struggle with reading. 80% of our kiddos who are SLD struggle in reading. And so when we see that in our BVI population as well, it creates some confusion. Oftentimes our kids with BVI aren't seeing words in print as often. That incidental learning piece that Carol Ann was talking about, they're not picking up on things in their environment without an explicit effort for them to see that, to have that introduced to them. And so, the spelling, for example, they may not have seen spelling in print as many times as other students have, and it takes exposure to language in print to learn how to spell correctly. If you're spelling phonetically, that could mask as dyslexia, but we know kids with dyslexia also spell phonetically, right? And so that's why it's often difficult to tease it out. But when we look at the federal definition of SLD, we're looking for a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes involved in understanding and using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, which is a huge definition, right? But what we're basically looking for is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses and performance in their achievement, and that is relative to their age, appropriate grade level standards, okay, relative to, going back to the RTI, to that instruction they've been exposed to, like based on what they've already been exposed to, should we expect more progress than we're seeing? And that was the case with my daughter. My mom is a retired, teacher of, first and second, and third grade remedial reading, had a big emphasis in reading, had worked with my daughter, all of her life, and we just weren't seeing the results that should have been expected for that level of intervention. And so that's one piece of the puzzle there that you would be looking for. Again, back to that, when they've been provided those learning experiences, that access, I think May was talking about, when they've already, that TVI has been, providing access, they've been getting the accommodations, and you're still not seeing that progress, okay? Then we might be thinking, okay, we need to, see if there's anything else going on. I know in my daughter, things that I look back now and see weren't as obvious. There were things like, always mixing up her left and right, always, and it's, dyslexia is not just about flipping words, and I don't want people to think I'm saying that. But that was just one thing I saw her struggle with for years. And then she would miscall the little words that you would think would be the automatic words, like the and the lee, and then get the bigger words. So that was kind of an interesting piece of the puzzle for her. But I just think it's important for educators and child study teams to be aware of the issues associated with the two disorders, occurring in tandem, and to be able to consider assessment and identification for both areas if it's necessary, because a failure to accurately identify the presence of both could result in students missing out on services.
Gosh, Beth, you're so good.
I
Oh, sorry, Carolyn, I
sorry.
didn't see you on this one. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not on this question, but I have to say this. To say that you can't have both is to say that you cannot have a hangnail and a heart condition.
Absolutely.
Well
It-
said.
Absolutely. I kind of joke that, you don't like stand in one line and you possibly only get one thing that you might be dealing with. And so, the key word, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, in the exclusionary clause of the federal definition of SLD has the keyword primarily in it. And that's really the word we need to focus on, because it's saying the vision and or hearing, because there's a question about hearing coming up, cannot be the primary, the primary cause of the difficulty. Like, we've addressed that, and now we still aren't seeing the progress we expect. And I use the example of my daughter having strabismus. Her eyes weren't teaming together. I wasn't going to call her SLD dyslexic until her eyes had both surgeries, and we've corrected that to the best extent, fullest extent possible, and she's still struggling. And so at that point, I felt like we could say, okay, we've addressed the vision. We've done everything we know to do. She's got her technology. She's got a CCTV. She's got everything, and her reading is still a struggle. So
Can I add one thing before Rebecca jumps in? Just one statistic.
I'm only in because the next question you've already started to answer, but yes, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, well, then I need to reorganize my thoughts with my language processing disorder. Beth, and so many people have said things already, I think, that already play into this question. But one of the things that I, in the work that we've done in talking about RTI and MTSS, and we put that link to that paper in the handout, was a statistic about this coexisting. I don't usually use the word comorbidity, the medical model, but coexisting was for VI 14 to 65%. Where in the overall population, we're talking 10 to 15. Some people are noting 20 to 25. That in the literature already, it's well established that there are going to be multiple things. And guidelines was the questions, and I don't know what the guidelines are, except for what everybody else has said before, May, Carol Ann, is that we just need these broad approaches to doing it, accommodated. So I just want to chime in.
Thank you. So building on that, question 8, when does hearing become an exclusionary factor based on IDEA definitions and ruleouts?
Okay, so I did jump the gun. But yes, the answer is the same. In my book, for vision and hearing, that word primarily is in there for a reason. And unfortunately, it has been misinterpreted up until just really recently. And, we just got guidance here in Texas from TEA about this, a few years ago, just a few short years ago. And so when we were seeing it be a problem. And so I really think we have to focus on, those, exclusionary factors, and to determine, are the struggles primarily due to that, or they go beyond the scope of what that vision or that hearing loss would, entail or impact. And so in your handout, you'll have some resources, again, that go towards this, that talk about the exclusionary clause, but also I have a couple of links in there that, so I had that TEA guidance document we got, I was just talking about, but I also have a couple of links related specifically to hearing impairments and deafness, one of which is from Gallaudet. It's a document with their recommendations for evaluation for their students. And I'm trying to remember what the other one, but there's two sources there to help you with hearing impairments. And I think one is from the Texas School for the Deaf and their outreach department, and some guidelines they give for assessments for the whole gamut of coexisting disabilities, but SLD is one of them that is included there on that page from the Texas School for the Deaf as well.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. And that builds nicely onto our next question. Question 9, how do you evaluate a student with dual sensory loss, deafblindness, for SLD? How would you test a student with low vision and mild hearing loss versus a student who is blind, no light perception, and has more extensive hearing loss?
So this is Meaghan speaking, and I just want to preface this by saying I am not a deafblind expert, and I guess I would caution you to believe anyone who said they are. This is an extremely complex area because of that that interaction between vision loss and hearing loss. And like the question asks, how do I approach assessment for a student who is maybe profoundly deaf and doesn't have light perception versus maybe a student who has been referred for an evaluation who has pretty good usable functional vision and maybe a mild hearing loss. And those are exactly the questions you want to be asking first, because anything you're doing subsequent to answering those questions is dependent on the answers to those questions. So you're going to really want to align all of your assessment conditions, the testing environment, the accommodations within that environment, the materials you're using, the communication modalities you're using, they're all dependent on what you've just asked at the second part of that question. So when I worked as a deafblind specialist in the state of Arizona, one of the first things I did when a team was approaching assessment was I made sure the school psychologist, the speech language pathologist or ASL specialist, and the teacher of students with visual impairment were all very closely connected and talking to one another, and also the teacher of the deaf if appropriate. So, the first thing we need to do is confirm the learning media, whether that student's a Braille user, if they are accessing large print, maybe they're using tactile symbols or a combination of those things. Maybe they're really depending on auditory input. And then really establish the students both receptive, what's coming in, and expressive or output communication modalities. So that might be American Sign Language, it might be protactile, it might be spoken English, or again, a combination of those. And then from there, that's where I'm going to set up my assessment environment and really lean into that multidisciplinary work. And so I'm just going to echo, it's not different for a deafblind student based on what all the folks before me have talked about, where we're really casting a broad net on trying to gather as much information as possible. And at the end of the day, just based on my experience, the teacher just wants to know, how can I engage this learner? How can I make sure that they have high quality access to information in my classroom? And how can I, what can I do? And I think that you're all probably adept at identifying that as the main question and then responding in a way that gives that teacher really functional information, practical information that they can take to their instruction the next day. I just want to leave you with 3 main ideas and resources because I can't do deafblind assessment all in 5 minutes. But I want to drop a couple of resources into the chat or the document. And one of those is a resource called the National Center on Deafblindness. Every state in the United States has a deafblind project. And I used to work on ours in Arizona. And their job is to provide technical assistance at no cost to your school district or state agency. And they're going to provide technical assistance to your team, especially if it's related to assessment of a deafblind student. And remember, deafblindness doesn't have to mean totally deaf, totally blind. It can be a little bit of each. And then what that deafblind project does is they can provide a range of services. They can disseminate information and resources to you. They can maybe provide a targeted training, or they can give you really extensive kind of ongoing technical assistance till you get to your established goal. They have a practice guide on assessment for deafblind students that's available for free on their website, and I have a direct link to that. And I just want that to kind of be put in your back pocket. So when it is time to assess a deafblind student in your setting, you have those resources at your fingertips. One other thing I found I used both as a speech language pathologist as well as a deafblind specialist are a couple of resources that really helped me learn how to be a good observer. I think that's a skill that we get a lot of it in our pre-service training, and then we really hone in on it in our actual practice, and especially if we have really good mentors that kind of speak into our ear and teach us what exactly we're looking for in our observations. So I always make sure, I have my my clipboard like a good speech pathologist and kind of what I'm looking for in the observation setting as I sit down to kind of be that fly on the wall. And NCDB, or the National Center on Deafblindness, actually has a classroom observation instrument. And this was especially helpful early on in my career when I still wasn't as intentional as I wanted to be about observation and what exactly I was looking for. And it's just a very extensive tool. You can use the whole thing with your team for what you want to see, what the student is doing in their specific classroom, and use that as part of your evaluation for SLD. Or you can take pieces out of it. Use it for whatever your need may be, whatever your assessment question may be. And then finally, something I use quite often is a document called IEP Considerations for deafblind students who are proficient communicators. I have the link to this as well. It was one of my most used resources with school teams. So, a lot of times I think the assumption can be that deafblind students might have a lot of communication or extensive communication needs. They might be really complex communicators. And while that may be true, we also work with a lot of students who we would call proficient communicators, meaning they're using American Sign Language and or spoken English proficiently alongside their hearing sighted peers. And so this document was developed by Robbie Blaha out of Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. And it really gives teams a nice kind of outlook or scope of those needs specific to deafblind learners who have a good handle on language, but who may have those other needs, specifically if they've got additional learning disabilities, if they have social emotional needs, if finding out exactly what they need in terms of access to information in their environments. And at the end of the day, with older students who are deafblind, I always want to interview them because they give me such high quality information about how they experience the spaces where they're learning. And I try and make sure that's a huge component of my evaluation information, from their perspective. Same thing when they're younger, I try and get a really good observation of their play because that also gives me a lot of information about how they experience the world with that dual sensory loss, with hearing and vision loss. So I hope those resources are a help to you when, again, you do find yourself assessing a deafblind individual, but also if you work with a student with visual impairment who does have additional disabilities, what we know about students with extensive support needs, when you meet their needs, you meet everybody's needs. And so I would highly recommend these resources for those students as well, the VI students you work with who have those complex communication needs. So I hope that's helpful, and you're back on, Rebecca.
Beautiful, Meaghan. Thank you so much. And someone just asked about getting the observation tool. It is in the handout, and in just a minute, I can pop it into the chat as well. So our next question is, can you provide a sample report or some templated report examples for this population? I would like some extra case profiles of how LD identification would look like in a student with existing VI eligibility at school. In addition, it would be helpful to go over some assessments used, targeted academic, cognitive, and processing areas with students with visual impairments and how that is used in combination with qualitative data gathered. Although every case is unique, it would be helpful for us, school psychologists, to have an example case report to look at so that we can learn how the assessments, RTI, PSW, qualitative data were used in combination or in isolation to make the determining factor for SLD. And I will put that in the chat and take it away, Beth.
Hi, everybody. All right, so I am providing you an example FIE that's redacted to give you an idea of the way we went about reporting it, and knowing that this would be probably used as a template for other kiddos, because let's be honest, there's a lot of professionals out there that don't have any experience testing a student with a VI, and are looking for anything they can get their hands on as to do that correctly. So I wanted to make sure that what we were doing was, teaching people, good ways to go about it instead of teaching people incorrect, ways. And one thing I want to say that I really feel like is important in this process is that we, that it's almost like the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, do no harm. And I think that's so important when we're evaluating kiddos with VI, that it's so easy to, if we don't make the correct adaptations, misrepresent their intelligence. And that's the last thing we want to do, guys. And part of that, and I think everybody on here knows and understands, but I'm just going to say it just in case, that, our standardized tests aren't normed on our population. And we need to be cognizant of that. Even when it's a Braille adaptation of a test, it's not normed on our population. And so we need to remember that. We need to think about, if part of the test is timed, we don't need to report the results. That alters the way that the test is being given. We can still get a lot of useful information from it and report that. And that anecdotal information really can be instructive, but let's not report things that might alter the picture of a kiddo. And so you'll see in the example that I provided, no full scale IQ is reported for that very reason, because there were components of the test that we couldn't do and because they were very visual tasks that we didn't feel like, kept up that reliability and validity of the measure. For my, the question that, asking about specific measures that you can give, I mentioned before, but I'll say it again. We gave, the WISC-5, the block design, the similarities test, the matrix reasoning, the digit span, the coding and vocabulary, and figure weights. As far as, specific to the reading piece and dyslexia, there used to be what we call the dyslexia profile, and that can still be used in the evaluation. It's just not the whole picture, but it kind of gives you a picture, a part of the picture as to where those patterns and weaknesses are with reading. And often a high indicator of dyslexia is that high listening comprehension that doesn't match with the reading fluency that you're seeing. And that's absolutely what we saw in my daughter. And so using those CTOP 2 sections that deal with blending words and deleting, repeating a sound, repeat it repeat it with a sound missing, the phoneme isolation, the memory for digits. Again, that was an example of one that could be auditory. It didn't take any accommodation because you're just repeating number sequences heard auditorily. The CTOP 2 non-word repetition, CTOP 2 rapid digit naming, rapid letter naming. Again, those both two are visual and verbal components. CTOP 2 also has a rapid color object naming, which is of course very visual, and we need to think about color contrast concerns there for our kiddos as well. We also gave the GORT-5 to try to get rate and accuracy ideas and fluency ideas about how my daughter and how, all it, you could use this to try to get an idea of a picture, but I don't think it's valid to really report a fluency rate. I think it's good to think about, a rate plus accuracy, giving us a picture of the efficiency of oral reading. But we're not going to always be able to use a reliable words correct per minute measure with our kiddos, because is that really measuring, the reading fluency, or is it measuring, how quickly they can see the information to be able to read it, which I know, depending, of course, again, on the visual impairment, could be the case. And that does remind me to say, learning about their specific visual condition before you go into the riot piece or the riot or the RIO, as May said, and then the T piece for the testing, learning about that specific visual impairment before you even get started and how it affects their vision, and looking at that information that was done in the functional vision evaluation from the TSVI, because that can tell you how you need to test as well. So like, optic nerve atrophy, it takes longer for the message to get from the eye to the brain. It takes longer for that image to become clear. Well, yeah, obviously a word correct per minute measure isn't you know, and if a kiddo is using assistive technology, that's not going to be, you know, necessarily a fair judgment. What I do think is good and more for informal purposes and for IEP goals is using a kiddo as their own baseline, so that you can say, you know, this is where they are now with reading fluency. We feel reading fluency is important. We want to improve that, but we're going to, you know, determine that goal based on their own, you know, their own progress compared to themselves, compared to, you know, a standard, you know, benchmark that we know for people without visual impairments that may not be applicable. And the last thing we gave was the WIAT-4, and that was to get more information on word reading, pseudo word decoding, reading fluency, reading comprehension, spelling, sentence composition, numerical operations, and math fluency. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea over what we did, but the main points I want you to remember is just, you know, not reporting scores for anything time, testing your limits, not reporting that full IQ score, and anecdotally describing what a student was able to do and not able to do when you can't report a score, because that information tells you very, you know, very valuable, actionable things, you know, beyond just the score. So I hope that's helpful, and I will turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Beth. Heather, you can come back. Our next question is question 11. What are specific examples of interventions and recommendations for math, reading, and writing that work well with BVI populations?
Leah, do you mind if I start on this one back to where Beth was, and then you can introduce this big piece that I'm going to totally clap hands and agree with? I added a note in the handout. It's so good to have that, Beth, like the big picture of what it looked like. But I wanted to name some stuff from general LD literature, and I put a note that it's not VI specific, but I think it is applicable here. Is that cognitive processing measures like phonological processing, rapid naming, verbal memory have been shown to help discriminate LD versus low achievement groups. And I feel like sometimes they were looking at this whole picture of each whole child, and yeah, it just might help differentiate their the LD from the VI related reading issues. So I just want to add that piece from VI. Sorry.
Okay, so I was going to start out just by briefly saying some things that you could look at overall, and then I'm just going to share some things that have worked for us at the Texas School for the Blind and Visual Impaired, and some of them I even used, you know, before I was working with visually impaired populations. The National Reading Panel back like in 1997 was commissioned to look at all the reading studies. We're having the reading wars. Is it whole language? Do you just look at the word and learn it that way? Or do you have to use phonics, which sounded so dry to people? And so they reviewed over 100,000 research studies, pulled out the ones that were the most rigorous and had the, you know, best promise for being really true research studies. And they came up with 5 pillars. So things to look at when you're trying to choose a you know, reading program is that they should include phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And those areas will be in the notes that you receive. Also, just that term science of reading has come about over the last few years. In fact, it kind of just hit me in the face one year when I was at a conference, and it seems like no one really had told us what it was, and they just started using it. But that's just based on many worldwide studies on reading and what the brain does when it reads. And it tells us that reading instruction should be direct, explicit, and systematic. And believe it or not, many, many years we didn't have that. So when you teach new concepts directly, you're giving explanations, you're modeling, you're giving them guided practice. When you teach explicitly, you're not leaving any room for confusion or ambiguity. And then systematically is really important. You're really going to plan that teaching, and you're going to build the concepts on top of each other so that the students aren't given, especially when they're earlier on in the reading process, they aren't given a task to read with words or sounds, especially the sounds that they haven't been directly taught. You want to have a system in place, so you're giving it to them very systematically. So let me just go over a few of the resources that I like. There's nothing magical about these. I mean, they worked for us, and I'm not here to make a profit off of these recommendations or anything. You'll notice when you look at my notes later, there's several companies I kind of go back to, but one of the things they talked about in the 5 pillars was phonological awareness, which leads up to phonemic awareness. And in case you're not familiar with those terms, that means hearing the ultimate level of phonemic awareness would be to hear separate sounds in words. So if a child hears the word fast, can they break it down into s? And that's a hallmark of dyslexia, that they can't. And so that makes it hard to map each sound to a letter, or whether it's print or braille, because they cannot hear those separate sounds and match them. So there's a great book that comes from Nyhouse, Reading Readiness. It's hard to spell, but it's in the notes. And there's a link to go there. And that's a Nyhouse Reading Readiness book. And it has great things. And you think of this as more for kindergarten, first, maybe second graders, but I've had to use some of these exercises for much older kids we get that still can't break a sentence into words. They don't know how to hear the cat ran down the street. Once again, it's kind of a blob to them. How to break words into syllables, how to separate words, and how to blend into the sounds, and then how to blend sounds. One thing to mention is that I really like it when you use cubes or magnets, something that the child has to tangibly move when you're hearing those sounds. For phonics, we want explicit programs based on the science of reading. One that I used back in the public school system with a variety of handicapping conditions, and that I've kind of brought over to the Texas School for the Blind for the classroom teachers, is from Really Great Reading. And if you just Google Really Great Reading, one thing I love about it, it has videos that help train you, that really give you that science of reading background. And then it has very spelled out lesson plans. Now, you do have to convert a lot of the materials into Braille. We have done that at the Texas School for the Blind. I think you would have to go to Really Great Reading to get them. We can't just hand them out because of copyright. But if you contacted Really Great Reading, they could, hopefully you could get a big jump start from everything that our wonderful Brailleist team has done at our school. For our more severe kids, what I do as a dyslexia specialist, I use it's kind of an Orton Gillingham based program, but it's not what you'll hear Orton Gillingham. It's called Basic Language Skills. You can get training at the Ross and Saunders Institute, which is, to all full disclosure, I trained with them for many years. And I just think they do a great job. I left there when I started working at the School for the Blind, but we have sent teachers back there that are working with our blind students. So they have had a little bit of experience with teachers getting certified who are working with visually impaired kids. Nyhouse Education Center does the same kind of training, and it's just great stuff. It's very intensive. It's, a fair amount of training time, but if you're looking for something for those really tough kids. Other things you'll see on the handouts, for fluency, you can make your own charts, just maybe they're just naming letters, or maybe they're giving the sounds for letters, or maybe it's those words that you've prepared for them to read. They know the sounds and the words. You can just make a chart with 5 or 6 words in a row, repeat the same 5 or 6 words in a row until you have about 5 rows, and then we time them for a minute, and then they just do that quick activity each day. Great Leaps is a program that is really out there in the regular ed world, and so we finally we got the digital files, we got them brailled, and I'm just about to start it myself. So if you contacted Great Leaps, hopefully they could connect you to get the braille files. A few more things, you'll just see some more ideas in your handouts. One thing I want to mention at the end, because they asked about math. The best thing I can say for math, but it's very time intensive to get the training. It used to be called Making Math Real. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, the director and producer of that program died unexpectedly. So now one of his protégés has continued that, and it's called M.Sense. So if you have that name on here, you contact that website, but I can tell you that training will give you really good, very direct instruction that we still have to adapt for our kids. None of these are designed for visually impaired, but I've had great luck from primary kids all the way up through high school, and the teachers want to know it and they want to learn it from me. So those are my recommendations.
I'm so sorry to cut that short, but we do only have 10 minutes left, so thank you so much. Okay, so the next question is for you, May. I will remind you again that we only have 10 minutes left. And our question is, how can we help educate others on the possibility of comorbidity and be more open to exploring other avenues that may be contributing to the students' challenges? Some TVI, school psychs, and education specialists who have been in the field for 20+ years are not as open to looking into other areas of disability due to the fact that they attribute all of the students' challenges to their VI blindness disability. There's a need for explicit instructions on the interpretation of evaluation data for VI and DB kids and specific instruction that accommodations are different from modifications. School districts are still denying SLD for our kids, and that long question is now in the chat.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'll try to keep it short so we'll have time for the other questions. Like Beth mentioned before, the sensory impairments and specific learning disabilities document from the Texas Education Agency is wonderful because it explicitly states that these can be co-occurring. We can have a student who is blind or a student who has low vision who also has co-occurring, coexisting specific learning disabilities. And again, emphasizing that primary part, we're looking at, is the vision impairment the primary cause? If there are other things going on, processing challenges, how can you tell which one is primarily causing it? There are other things going on. When we're looking at, there's practices that have been done for years, and that doesn't mean that they're correct just because they've been done for a long time. There's examples where, states have been doing practices that don't follow the federal regulations. So different states like Wyoming and Kentucky, they actually released guidance documents for their states saying how, although their state laws might state one thing where they're including specific visual acuity or specific visual field restrictions for eligibility under visual impairment for special education eligibility, this actually is wrong. And although their state laws might not be updated yet to follow the federal regulations. So there is, documented history where there are practices that have been done, which, later have been corrected. So when we're looking at different things that might support this, again, going to that Texas Education Agency document, it really clearly states it, which is really nice. And looking at our federal register, so there is policy guidance called Educating Blind and Visually Impaired Students. And there's a nice quote from there that supports that, we need to be looking at their visual impairment, but also looking at how the student is involved and progressing with the general ed curriculum, looking at academic assessment and what will help the student to learn to read and write and be involved in science and math and computing. The evaluation needs to be in any way accommodated or modified so that we're making sure that they have appropriate access to evaluation, but also looking at all the unique needs that arise from being blind or having low vision. And so something that we haven't addressed in this particular webinar yet is the expanded core curriculum. There's all these different skills students who are blind and low vision need. And so there are many different things, and I do want to keep it short. So I'll put those links in the handout and we can move on to question 13.
Thank you, May. All right, question 13. What are your thoughts on using Braille with students with learning disabilities who are not blind?
Okay, so I will take this question. This is Meaghan Adams. I'll take this and answer it pretty quick. So there is some research on using Braille or tactile methods with sight students who have dyslexia, but it's not a lot of research. It's very limited, and the results are varying. And then the recent reviews for that research really call for higher quality trials. So it's important to note that most Braille research focuses on students who are blind or who have low vision. But the studies specifically testing Braille as an intervention for sighted students, those findings are usually coming from small samples, case studies, or lab tests. So and overall, I would just really caution against this practice. So if we go back to what everybody has been talking about today, dyslexia is not a visual processing disorder. So it's that neurological disorder, with characteristics of difficulty with accurate or fluent word recognition and poor decoding and spelling abilities. So students with dyslexia show weaknesses in either auditory processing or orthographic processing skills. So if you're looking back at the research too, I think it's very fascinating, and looking at research shows that blind or visually impaired students and sighted students actually master phonological and phonemic awareness skills at the same rate. So again, I don't think teaching Braille to sighted students, it's not going to compensate for those auditory processing deficits that they have. So and everyone has talked about all the great research out there, especially with the science of reading and all the state mandates with dyslexia on very much so research-based interventions for kiddos with dyslexia. So I would definitely go that route. And if you have a chance to look at the research on auditory processing and sighted students or students with blind or visual, impairments, and then it talks about how they differ in fluency and how that can be teased out to be attributed to maybe dyslexia or the visual impairment, and then also language and vocabulary development. So there we go.
I will say one thing in regard to this. There aren't enough teachers of the visually impaired to teach even the students who qualify as visually impaired Braille. And so it's just not an effective intervention for all the reasons Meaghan just stated. Also, is this where I can talk about my favorite intervention, May? We said there would be a place where I can do this. Okay, she's giving me the upward thumb. And many years ago, I started using recorded books with my low vision and blind students who were very delayed in their reading development. There were some articles in some of the consumer literature about the importance of developing listening skills in our students, because that would be their most accessible, their most efficient access to information. And as I started doing this, I noticed that they made progress in their reading. And so one day I was in a high school resource room off in a corner with a student of mine with retinitis pigmentosa, and he was using a big CCTV, the kind you have to put on a cart and roll around the school to go to all your classes. They're much smaller and more portable now. And we were using a recorded book. And the resource teachers came to me afterward and said, "Can you get those books for our students?" And so I started. It was when RFB&D, Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic, had us list our individual students with their individual accounts. And so I started ordering the occasional book for their students on my student's account. Don't report me. And then they started having success with that. And then in a junior high, after I became a school psychologist, I was in a junior high, and the resource teacher and I decided to do what was called an action research project. And we reported it in a state conference for action research. And we had students that were failing their content area classes. They couldn't get the homework done. They couldn't get decent scores on tests. So we got what was then high tech for the time, a listening station where each student could plug in their own headphones. Now, we couldn't vary the speed. They all had to listen at the same speed. But then they all passed their classes. They all got respectable scores on tests and got their homework in. And so Anyway, that's my pitch, and you'll find my PowerPoint presentation in the resources.
Sorry to cut you off, Carol.
It's okay.
Okay, and I know it's almost 12:30. If you do have to go, we understand, but we have one more wonderful question if you're able to stay. Our final question is for Meaghan. Do you have any behavior resources or strategies you like to use with students who have limited communication ability?
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick with this too. There is a handout that I threw together just of the things that our teams traditionally use for any child, but that can really work for kiddos with communication disorders or any type of delay in communication. So the first would be behavior equals communication, right? So it really goes back to the whole FBA, functional behavioral analysis, when we're looking at the function of the behavior. And so if we know the function and we know what the child is trying to communicate, we can intervene a lot better than if we don't investigate that. And we are, adding to our FBA repertoires by doing things like antecedent-based interventions based on the function once we figure that out. I know it's challenging, for example, working with a team to figure out the function of behavior for a deaf-blind student that had zero communication skills. And so we really had to work together as a team to figure out what she needed and break that down throughout her day. And then we could implement interventions and supports and tools throughout her day. So the second area is just building in communication supports, anything like AC tools, low tech things such as PECs or communication books, choice boards, all the way up to high tech. Well, I call it high tech because I still think an iPad is high tech, but watching some of these kids navigate iPads, I don't know anymore if it's high tech. But anyway, things like that to help students communicate. Then it goes on to talk about just positive behavior supports, which is really structuring the environment in your classroom. And it kind of ties into interventions that you would develop on an intervention plan after conducting an FBA. And then it also goes into talking about sensory and environment supports. If you don't know anything about sensory diets, those are really fun. If you have occupational therapists, they're definitely the experts. They can help you figure out the sensory needs of students. Sometimes behaviors are due to sensory needs, and we can have what we call a sensory diet throughout their day. And again, intervene depending on the time of the day and if they're overstimulated, understimulated, that kind of thing. And then just database practices. So it talks about data collection and team approach and frameworks to align with. So MTSS, PBIS, and function communication training. So there we go.
Nicely done, Meaghan. Did any of our other panelists want to chime in on that? No? Oh, go ahead,
This is
Meaghan. Other
Meaghan. I
Meaghan.
just wanted to say I added in a couple of resources specific to deaf blindness, but again, they work for any student with a visual impairment who has those additional communication needs.
And this is Alessia. I do counseling as part of my role here at Perkins, and I think I love zones of regulation. You can make it tactile, you can braille it, but my recommendation would be to try to give students strategies where they don't have to access their words as much when they're having a hard time. So we use break cards a lot. I've got like a set of break cards here. My students wear these around their lanyards. If they need to sign, that they need to take a break, anything to really limit the amount of verbal communication that they need to access when they're having a hard time. Sensory rooms, we have those all around the school, sensory bags, etc. But talking to them and like laying on the communication is what we try to do the least amount of.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I know we went a little bit over our time. Really appreciate all the great interest and great questions. And thank you to all of our panelists for all your wonderful insights and the resources that you provided us all. Hope to see everyone at our next session, and thank you. Bye.